The light died, then it breathed. I heard it before I saw it. A single metallic rasp like an old radio. Scratching for a station, I sat up. The room was cold. The house slept around me like a beast with one open eye. My hands found the bedside table. The old radio, the one from the kitchen, sat there. Because I'd carried it in like a talisman, it pulsed once, a faint, dead hum. My fingers brushed the dial. It clicked, nothing, then a whisper of static. I rose, bare feet on the floorboards. The house tasted of tar and rain through the window. I moved without thinking, toward the hallway, toward the sound that had always been at the center of everything that belonged to this place. You remember that sensation? The way an old set warmed with hiss, the way voices appeared and fell apart in the crackle. That's the sense I had now, familiar like a voice I needed to hear, dangerous like a voice that remembered things I had tried not to remember. The stairway was a throat of shadow. Each step complained as I ascended. The living room lay open, the windows like blind eyes. On the mantel sat the radio I'd repaired when I was young, the one that had once played country road songs while my mother hummed. Its tuning knob wobbled, static, a ghost of a melody. I should have left then. I almost walked out the front door, bags already half-packed in the hallway, but the radio clicked, bright as a coin. Dropped, a thin little tune slipped free of the hiss, an old jingle from a roadside diner we used to haunt. After late shows, I stood frozen, listening. The smell of coffee and vinyl unfurled in my head. My hand tightened on the radio like a prayer, and from somewhere above the attic laughed, or maybe it was the radio, a thin, hungry sound, small and human, pressed against the rafters. I gripped the banister. The pull of memory in the house tugged me upward. At the top, the attic hatch hung open like a mouth. The radio hissed again, answering me as if it had been waiting. I reached my hand into the dark and felt something warm and wooden, like memory and promise. I found a pocket watch wrapped in oilcloth, or maybe it was the shape of a cassette in my hand. The radio crackled and the attic closed in. I took it down. The clock in the living room, dead for years, ticked once, then twice, then a third time, too slow. Like a man waking up wrong, the house listened. I realized then that I had crossed a line. Something had shifted. The radio, the attic, the watch, whatever small things anchored this place, had opened. And looked back. I should have left. I didn't. The dial on the radio spun with a will that was not mine, settling on a frequency that played my childhood. The voice on the air said my name. The morning came in thin as breath. The kitchen was a theater of dust, shafts of pale sunlight cutting through floating particles. The radio on the counter sat where I'd left it, the dial steady now, humming a low, threadbare ballad. I poured coffee and watched the steam scribble the same thin lines I'd learned to read as a boy: direction, mood, weather. The coffee tasted of grounds and memory. I moved like a man who had practiced being brave. Outside, the porch light blinked in a slow morse of old storms. Inside, the house offered up a dozen small noises in a precise arrangement. The radiator ticking, the floorboard by the pantry giving a long sigh, the soft, almost polite cough of the stair where my father once carried groceries. The radio hummed under them all. There were photographs, 3 on the mantel, my mother in a dress with a collar like the 50s, a county fair behind her, my brother with son in his hair by an old Chevy, me, younger and straighter, grinning like the world itself had given us room. I remembered the year, the smell of frying dough at the fair, the way the record player at the diner would scratch when the needle found a groove, vinyl, cheap coffee and laughter. It seemed impossible that those smells could reopen pain, but they did. The radio whistled and then dropped its voice to a low, private frequency. Static cleared like a throat. A voice murmured a jingle I hadn't heard since a gas station on Route 18. Fill up and fly on. I could see the place, neon, a counter, gum stuck under the stools. The memory was a small film playing inside the head, and the house watched me watch it. I began to examine the rooms properly. Kitchen cabinets yielded only dust and a rusted tin of pins. The pantry had been emptied long ago, except for a single jar of pennies on the back shelf. My hand hovered above it. The pennies were dry and warm, like coins that had held sunlight. I remembered my brother tipping the jar into his palm and letting the little copper rain fall. He loved the clink. I found that same pleased clink inside my chest now, cold and private. Upstairs, the radio's sound leaked like smoke. It seemed to orient itself toward the study, a room I had avoided for 20 years. The door there was ever so slightly ajar. When I pushed it, the house breathed a long sigh and the static cleared to reveal a voice speaking my name, soft and close, as if leaning in to remind me of something I had promised. I felt the old ache trickle up my arms, the ache that comes when you discover a photograph has been altered without your permission. I opened the desk drawer. Inside lay a cassette case, labeled in my brother's messy hand, June '89, don't believe. I held it like contraband. The radio seemed to answer with a faint, private laugh on the air, the puckish kind my brother would have made. Behind his hands, I thought of the two-lane highway, the Chevy's engine humming under a sky of punched-out stars, the radio between us offering dramas and late-night DJs. Those nights had been the most alive. The house had kept the residue of all of it, soundtracks, smells, a small constellation of petty truths, and now it was returning them to me in pieces like offerings. I did not open the cassette. I could feel something watching from the corners, a thing patient and domestic, more like guilt than a ghost. The radio crackled, gentle as a finger tapping the glass of a window. It was calling me back. I found the record player in the attic, dusty and stubborn as a relic from a corner drugstore. The needle arm hung like a hand waiting for permission. Around it, boxes and trunks lay open, spilling decades into the rafters, yearbooks, bumper stickers, a faded program from a county fair where I'd won a prize for a picture of a Ferris wheel at dusk. The radio's hum was a thread connecting it all. I sat among the boxes and listened. The attic smelled of old paper and rope, of engine oil and the sweet rot of stored things. My fingers brushed an old cassette mixtape, handwriting across its case. The label read Road Trip '85. I could hear the bossa nova from a diner radio under the static, feel the heat of a Chevy's hood under my palms. My brother had made me mixtapes. He'd burned songs on tapes like little offerings, marking them with blunt scrawl. He thought certain songs made the world safe. He was wrong. Flashback August 1985. The two-lane highway unfurled like a ribbon. My brother played a song too loud. We laughed so hard the air in the car vibrated. The radio needle jumped. A DJ announced a fair contest and my brother shouted that he'd enter us both. We stopped at a diner with a neon sign that hummed like a bee. There was a jukebox with a crooked coin slot and a waitress who knew our names. We were not thinking about anything heavy then. We were thinking about how the road never ended. Back in the attic, the radio offered a single clear line of melody. It was the chorus of a tune that used to make my brother grin like an idiot. My throat closed. The attic listened. A trunk popped open on its own. A sound like a throat clearing. Inside, a stack of Polaroids slid free. Sunlight, a picnic blanket. My brother's laugh caught in glossy paper. Only then, in one photograph, the background was strange. The house's porch stood empty, and the corner where the date should be was smudged, like someone had rubbed away an uncomfortable truth. I left the attic with the mixtape in my pocket and a weight in my hands. The radio in the kitchen had shifted its tone to something lower now, like a bass line underneath. A thought. The house felt smaller. The rooms closed in around the memory of us, our stupid jokes. Late-night diners, the way vinyl scratched and stitched the world together for an hour. I had the sense that each artifact I moved rearranged the house's memory map. It watched as carefully as watching a mapmaker erase the wrong lines. That night the radio's volume rose in the dark. I lay awake, counting the small sounds, the refrigerator's nervous tick, the sigh of the old furnace, the distant rumble of a truck on the highway, and under them all, the radio playing a melody I knew would end in a lyric that once made my brother cry. The days bled into each other with a slow, merciless sameness. I kept the radio beside me like an oracle I'd half accepted. Its tuning wheel spun when I wasn't looking, settling on stations that whispered compliments or accusations at odd hours. Once it tuned to a late-night talk show, two voices arguing about fate and choice, and the host said offhand that some houses remember their occupants with more accuracy than the occupants remember themselves. I laughed then, dry and small, and the radio cut to silence. I began to notice the small rearrangements. A coat left on a peg in the hall would be found a day later on the stair. A mug moved an inch. The pennies in the back of the pantry jar seemed to sit at different heights whenever I checked them. Once, in the laundry room, I found a cassette rewound to a point where a voice spoke my brother's name and said, "You promised." My hands shook. The laundry came alive with the hum of the washer and something softer, like a voice under lint. Flashback 1979 County Fair. Ferris wheel lights went up like a halo. My mother bought us cotton candy and told us to stay together. My brother dared me to climb onto the roof of the old Chevy to watch the Fireworks, we had sticky hands and the taste of sugar and the negligent feeling of invincibility. We were 13, convinced we were the center of our own myth. The radio in the fair booth played a folk tune. That smelled like smoke and laughter. I can still hear its cadence in my head. Now the same songs. Played in the house like echoes left behind, as if a needle had been set to replay the same groove. Some nights at 2 in the morning, the radio would find a station playing diner chatter, the clack of cups on saucers, the end of a joke, and I would swear I could smell frying fat and hear the jukebox in the corner. Once, the radio spat words from a DJ who had died years ago. His laugh unfurled like a ribbon and then snapped. I bent over the set, feeling foolish and grateful at once. In the attic, I found a box marked "Do Not Open." I opened it. Inside lay a pile of letters folded to exhaustion, and at the bottom, a cassette with handwriting that wasn't my brother's but my father's. On the tape, his voice was slow, patient. He spoke of leaving, of debts and promises, of things a man shouldn't leave behind. My father had been a man of few revelations. To hear him on tape felt like a betrayal of the dead and a kindness to the living. I pressed my ear to the cassette player, and he said in the background, "The house knows." The radio in the parlor laughed as if on cue. I began to feel that the house was less of a place and more of an accumulation, a slow compound of memory where sounds and objects acted like ledger entries. It stored us, it sorted us, it reminded us, and when it wanted, it returned the entries in peculiar order to see if we recognized what we'd been. Each return felt like an accusation and an invitation at once. I started to dream with the radio on, dreams that were half-remembered songs, snippets of conversations, an announcer's voice slipping into my sleep and pronouncing trivialities as if they were verdicts. I woke sweating to a particular tune, a greasy spoon melody I associated with midnight burgers and my brother's elbow nudging mine as we traded confidences over ketchup stains. The radio held those scraps like a child holds marbles. The object that had been a talisman now felt like a hinge. I carried it into every room. People talk about scent as the strongest sense for memory. For me it was sound. The radio could unlock a room of recollection with a dial twist. Once it spun itself and landed on static that resolved into a voice reciting my brother's handwriting, short, clipped lines from an old letter. I read the words again and felt the pages of time flutter. They were about promises and the instruction not to go back. He'd written, "Not everything settles when you leave." The radio hummed agreement. I began to keep a notebook. I wrote down each time the radio chose something that smelled like a fair or a diner. I wrote the time, the song, the memory it unspooled. The notebook filled with small griefs, images of roadside signs, of jukebox lights, of the inside of a Chevy at 3 in the morning. The house, I thought, was conducting an orchestra of memories, and I was its audience. Sometimes I felt that if I could catalog everything, the house would relent. Montages of the past would be satisfied, and sleep would return. It did not. One afternoon, a woman arrived at the porch. She was small and steady, eyes like thin coins. She claimed to be an appraiser, someone tracing family histories through objects. We talked on the porch while the radio played a static undercurrent. She asked about my family. I told her the thin facts, names, dates, the county fair, the Chevy. She smiled without joy and said houses have layers. Then she asked if she might look at the old records, the boxes upstairs. I said yes and watched her move through the rooms the way a shark moves water, smooth, efficient, impersonal. She opened the "Do Not Open" box with gloved hands and read one of the letters, and then she closed the notebook and said quietly, "Some houses keep you like a pressed flower." That night, the radio played a commercial that mentioned a highway exit I hadn't thought of in 30 years. It triggered a cascade, the smell of tar, the image of a cigarette-smudged map, my brother's thumb on the route he swore would lead us away. I imagined the house as a kind of device that tested whether its occupants could bear to remember. The appraiser left at dusk, carrying a box of documents. She did not ask for payment. She did not leave a card. The radio sang me a lullaby with a newsbreak in the middle. The house exhaled. Spring came soggy and late. Rain threaded down the panes like fingers. The rhythm changed in the house. The moisture made wood sigh differently, and the radio's sound seemed to have more body. I began to notice patterns, how the radio returned to certain stations at certain hours, like a sleepwalker's route. I mapped it in the notebook: 2:12 a.m. diner talk, 3:03 a.m. wire service news. Blip 4:44 a.m., a song about a road that never ends. The house was a clock that counted in memory. Once I found a tape recorded in my brother's voice that I did not remember him making. He spoke to a camera someone had set up in the attic, voice steady, eyes unfixed. He said things that made my skin crawl, about promises and a thing that lived in the floorboards and would wake hungry. He laughed. Then a sound, half apology, half dare. I listened until the tape warped and the voice began to stutter. Then I stopped it and pressed my palms over my eyes. The radio outside the attic door hummed like it. Approved, flashback, late night drives, 1991. The dashboard glow, the smell of motor oil in summer. My brother sang slightly off-key to a song the radio gave us. We thought the road would fix us. We thought speed was a solution to unfinished things. We were so young then, certain, merciless in our impatience. Things escalated in small ways. Once I found the kitchen wall scratched with lines, tally marks that matched the nights I had stayed awake listening to the radio. 3 nights, then 5, then 9. Another night a glass slid off the table and broke, spelling out, by accident or design, the letters of my brother's name across the scatter. I started to see departures, shadows that were not mine, movements of air that carried the scent of his cologne. The house was making conversation in its own language, and it spoke me often. I confronted it with logic. I rewired the radio, replaced the tube, cleaned its guts with the kind of mechanical tenderness a man gives an old friend. For a while it behaved, it played music predictably. Then, one evening, as I balanced a screw on the edge of the kitchen counter, the radio clicked and played a clip of my father's voice from the attic tape. He said, "You never know what a house will ask of you." The screw fell from my hand. I understood then that the house had a patience I did not. The house's patience turned into urgency. The radio's selections started to line up into narratives. Song about a late-night diner, then a commercial about a lost child's flyer, then a DJ laugh that broke. Like glass, the arcs fit together like sentences, and I felt like someone being read a story about myself. That left out key facts. I grew obsessive. I tuned in when the night was thick and let the radio stitch my past into a quilt I could not fold away. I found a letter hidden behind a baseboard in the study, edges yellowed and the ink faded to weakness. It was addressed to me in my brother's handwriting. The paper felt like a relic, and the words were a map of things I'd suspected but never allowed to be true. He wrote about a door in the house that should never be opened, about a debt that settled itself only sound and silence. He begged me not to go upstairs after midnight, for the house remembered at that hour. The radio, as if on cue, played a song about bad roads and worse decisions. I went upstairs. Anyway, the attic ladder waited like an accusation. The radio in the hall was muffled but precise. On the landing, a small pile of my brother's belongings lay as if he had stepped out and never returned. Cigarette case, folded map, a lighter with a church emblem. A photograph lay face down. I turned it. Our faces were younger, wind-burned, smiles like promises, but something behind us in the photograph was wrong. An empty porch where a figure should be, a smear where a face had been removed. I heard a voice then, not from the radio but from the house itself, a whisper that could have been wind or memory. "You were the one who left." The sentence landed like a hand on my shoulder. I felt my throat close. I remembered then how, years ago, I had walked out the door with a bag and a look that said I would not return. I had meant it. I had meant to make the house into an artifact, but the house kept records in a way I had never considered. Sound, object, tally. I understood in a cold, mechanical way that the house wanted correction. It wanted the story to be righted, or at least complete. That night the radio offered a tape of static that resolved into voices, my mother singing. Then my brother's soft voice saying, "Stay if you must, leave if you must, but remember." The radio's tone folded into something like apology. I slept with the light on and the radio near my chest like a beating animal. By late summer the house had sharpened into a presence. Dreams and waking braided together until I could not tell which was confession and which was trick. The radio was a seam, open and leaking. It offered fragments, an announcer giving a weather report, a jingle from a gas station, then a string of static that sounded like someone whispering a name. I started leaving water glasses near the radio. Little islands of current, an attempt to placate whatever measured me. One night I followed the radio's sequence like a trail of breadcrumbs. It led me from the kitchen to the study to the back hallway where the wallpaper peeled in a way that suggested fingers. The radio's voice had become insistent. Sing-song pulling at corners of memory that had been neatly folded away. I found a trapdoor, cleverly hidden beneath a rug my mother had once woven. It was small and smelled of mice and sealed letters. Under the trapdoor was another, and then another, a series of nested rooms like Russian dolls. The radio hummed from somewhere deep beneath, like a broadcast from a well. Flashback of February. Night in 1990. The vinyl at the diner scratched at the beginning of a slow song. My brother and I split it. Pie and argued about nothing. The radio at the bar announced a storm and our decision to keep driving. We thought the road would let us out of that smallness. We thought wrong. Down below the air was cold and dry, carrying the scent of concrete and old oil. The walls were lined with boxes and, inexplicably, a pair of empty shoes polished to a mirror shine. There were notes hunched like mice, recipes, scribbled lists, entries in a ledger with names and dates. The radio, somewhere above, sent down a single bright note that sounded like recognition. It was as if the house had been scoring its own ledger and wanted me to read it aloud. I read names, dates, payments, and at the margins, in my brother's tight handwriting, the phrase, taken at the fair. My scalp prickled, my hands shook. The radio above settled into a hum of approval, and the lights in the house dimmed as if someone had tucked the rooms into sleep. I understood then that the house wanted to close a loop. It wanted an accounting. I tried to bargain. I offered to leave. I offered to burn the boxes, to throw the records into the yard, to surrender the radio to the creek. The house did not bargain. It continued to present its ledger with impartiality. When I brought the map of the two-lane highways and traced a route away at midnight, the radio played a steady, plain tune about returning. It was as if the house recorded my intentions and then wrote its own addendum. You think you can leave what you owe. I found a final tape in the deepest room, tucked into a book of church hymns. My brother's voice was on it, raw and close. He told a story about the fair, about the Ferris wheel, about a prize that meant more than it should. There was a time-stamped June when the nights are long and the lights are bright, and a name. He talked about door that should never be opened unless you plan to stay to hear the truth. The tape ended with him laughing, brittle and sharp, then the sound of a radio tuning. The static resolved into a voice that I recognized and could not place, the voice of the announcer who had once sold us roots and gas. I sat in the dark and listened. Each word was a small accusation. The radio, inches away, softened the edges of the recording as if nudging me toward mercy. I thought of all the times I'd driven away, thinking the road could scrub me clean. I thought of the way my brother had smiled at me in pictures, at how his eyes always seemed like they were searching for something just out of frame. At dawn I stood on the porch and watched the sky turn. The radio played a hymn faintly from the house, as if in comfort. I realized then the true cruelty of this place. It did not simply keep ghosts, it kept obligations. It measured what we had left undone and returned it in forms we could not ignore. I turned the dial one last time, feeling like a man closing a ledger. The radio hummed and for one crooked second played. Silence. The ledger remained open. For a while after that morning, the house offered me small mercies, quiet afternoons, the radio tuned to easy listening, the pennies in the jar sitting level. I convinced myself the thing had been satisfied. I mopped the floor and put the records back in their sleeves. I told myself that if I kept the radio close enough, I would never again be surprised by a tape or a photograph or the way the attic hatch sighed. But the house is clever. It accepts gestures and yet it keeps pressure. One night, I found the photograph from the attic beneath my pillow. It was the one with the smudged background. The porch in the picture was empty except for an impression, like the ghost of a chair where someone had been standing. Behind it, written in pencil on the back, was a single sentence in my brother's hand. You promised to look back. I understood then the shape of the debt. It was not monetary, it was not even strictly moral. It was the obligation to witness, to be a part of the story rather than the editor who erases what he dislikes. The house wanted recognition, and it was willing to keep us in place to get it. That night I climbed the attic and placed the radio on the center plinth where the light pooled. I tuned it gently, like someone tuning a harp. The music spilled out and filled the rafters. I took down the photograph and laid it beside the set. I spoke aloud. It felt foolish, but the house had always liked theater. I told the room everything, my leaving, my lies, the nights I'd been cruel, the times I had been absent. I said my brother's name until it hurt. The radio hummed in sympathy. The attic seemed to Breathe with me. The floor under my feet was no longer just wood. It felt like a ledger page, a surface that accepted ink and memory alike. When I finished, I set the photograph back on the plinth and waited. The radio stuttered, and then, with a clarity that felt like a benediction or a verdict, it played a song we both loved, a small, ordinary song about a road and a light. The house answered with a soft exhale. I left the attic then, closing the hatch behind me. The house was quieter but not at peace. It had received an account, and now perhaps it would keep it. I cannot say that I was absolved. I cannot say the past loosened its hold. What I can say is that I stepped outside into a sky that smelled faintly of rain and gasoline, and felt, for a single, peculiar moment, like a man who had at least tried to remember. The radio sits on my table still. Sometimes, late, it plays a song I do not know, and I press my ear to it and hope it is a story that will be kind. The attic hatch creaks on some nights as if someone is settling into the rafters, and sometimes when the wind comes down the highway, I swear I can hear in the static a single voice call my name, and then, just beyond, a laugh like someone unlocking a door.